Good evening and welcome to DebtCircle Sundown Brief for the 22nd of May 2026. I am Leela, bringing you today's complete update from the debt markets, mutual funds, government securities, currencies, commodities, and primary issuances. Let us begin with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bonds. Berar Finance Limited recorded a yield of 19.52% with a trade value of 0.07 lakh rupees. Kirtana Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 18.28% with a trade value of 0.11 lakh rupees. Edelweiss Asset Reconstruction Company Limited recorded a yield of 16.85% with a trade value of 420 lakh rupees. Navi Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 16.72% with a trade value of 0.04 lakh rupees. Midland Microfin Limited recorded a yield of 16.50% with a trade value of 0.20 lakh rupees. Moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bonds. True Credits Private Limited recorded a yield of 15.30% with a trade value of 400 lakh rupees. Apex Homes Private Limited recorded a yield of 14% with a trade value of 4,192.07 lakh rupees. Hindon Mercantile Limited recorded a yield of 14% with a trade value of 500 lakh rupees. Navi Limited recorded a yield of 13.80% with a trade value of 750 lakh rupees. SI Creva Capital Services Private Limited recorded a yield of 12.50% with a trade value of 500 lakh rupees. Now let us look at mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at 16,029.24 crore rupees. Gross sales stood at 18,563.11 crore rupees. Net investment stood at negative 2,533.87 crore rupees. Net investment for May, month to date, stood at negative 37,505.580 crore rupees. Coming to foreign portfolio investor debt market investments. Under the general limit category, gross purchases stood at 0.00 crore rupees. Under the voluntary retention route, gross purchases stood at 502.82 crore rupees. Under the fully accessible route, gross purchases stood at 757.35 crore rupees. Under the general limit category, gross sales stood at 337.61 crore rupees. Under the voluntary retention route, gross sales stood at 124.30 crore rupees. Under the fully accessible route, gross sales stood at 553.27 crore rupees. Net investment under the general limit category stood at negative 337.61 crore rupees. Net investment under the voluntary retention route stood at 378.52 crore rupees. Net investment under the fully accessible route stood at 204.08 crore rupees. Net investment for May, month to date, under the general limit category stood at negative 400.57 crore rupees. Under the voluntary retention route, month-to-date investment stood at 703.14 crore rupees. Under the fully accessible route, month-to-date investment stood at 4,260.65 crore rupees. Net investment for calendar year 2026 year-to-date under the general limit category stood at negative 3,696 crore rupees. Under the voluntary retention route, year-to-date investment stood at negative 701 crore rupees. Under the fully accessible route, year-to-date investment stood at 14,469 crore rupees. Let us now review money market rates. Call rate stood at 5.37%. Tri-party repo stood at 5.26%. Basket repo stood at 5.32%. Special repo stood at 5.13%. Moving to India government bond yields. 1-year government bond yield stood at 6.16%. 3-year government bond yield stood at 6.69%. 5-year government bond yield stood at 6.93%. 7-year government bond yield stood at 7.06%. 9-year government bond yield stood at 6.96%. 10-year government bond yield stood at 7.09%. 15-year government bond yield stood at 7.39%. 30-year government bond yield stood at 7.67%. Now the Treasury bill yields and auction cutoffs. 91-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.52%. 182-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.75%. 364-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.97%. Coming to liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at negative 1,91,572 crore rupees. Standing deposit facility stood at 2,09,146 crore rupees. Marginal standing facilities stood at 1,569 crore rupees. Let us now look at MIBOR OIS rates. 1-year rate stood at 6.28%, 2-year rate stood at 6.50%, 3-year rate stood at 6.62%, 5-year rate stood at 6.80%. Moving to modified MIFOR rates. 2-year modified MIFOR stood at 7.16%. 3-year modified MIFOR stood at 7.15%. 4-year modified MIFOR stood at 7.33%. 5-year modified MIFOR stood at 0.00%. Now the latest currency rates. United States dollar against Indian rupee stood at 95.73 rupees compared to the previous level of 96.37 rupees. Euro against Indian rupee stood at 110.95 rupees compared to the previous level of 111.80 rupees. British pound against Indian rupee stood at 128.44 rupees compared to the previous level of 129.34 rupees. Japanese yen against Indian rupee stood at 0.60 rupees compared to the previous level of 0.61 rupees. Chinese yuan against Indian rupee stood at 14.11 rupees compared to the previous level of 14.15 rupees. Moving to commodities and indices. 24-karat gold 99.9 purity stood at 15,949 rupees per 10 grams compared to the previous level of 15,993 rupees. Silver stood at 2,850 rupees per 10 grams, unchanged from the previous level of 2,850 rupees. Crude oil stood at $104.42 compared to the previous level of $107.43. Sensex closed at 75,415.35 compared to the previous level of 75,183.36. Nifty closed at 23,719.30 compared to the previous level of 23,654.70. Finally, let us review India primary issuance in corporate bonds. Tata Capital Limited announced an issuance of 2,950 crore rupees with a tenure of 34 months. CSL Finance Limited announced an issuance of 30 crore rupees with a tenure of 25 months and a coupon of 11.00%. The instrument carries an Accurate Ratings and Research Limited rating of A-. Nuvama Wealth and Investment Limited announced an issuance of 200 crore rupees with a tenure of 22 months and a coupon of 8.90%. The issuance carries ratings from CRISIL Ratings Limited of AAA, ICRA Limited AA, and ICRA Limited AAA. Navi Finserv Limited announced an issuance of 330 crore rupees with multiple tranches ranging from 20 months to 32 months and coupon rates ranging from 10.30% to 10.75%. NIIF Infrastructure Finance Limited announced an issuance of 450 crore rupees with a tenure of 64 months and a coupon of 7.88%. Cholamandalam Investment and Finance Company Limited announced an issuance of 317 crore rupees with a tenure of 37 months and a coupon of 8.08%. Kirtana Finserv Limited announced an issuance of 45 crore rupees with a tenure of 17 months and a coupon of 12.00%. Viviana Powertech Limited announced an issuance of 20 crore rupees with a tenure of 25 months and a coupon of 12.00%. The instrument carries a BBB rating. Kalpataru Properties Limited announced an issuance of 1,635 crore rupees with a tenure of 49 months and a coupon of 8.00%. The issuance carries a BBB rating from India Rating and Research Private Limited. ICICI Home Finance Company Limited announced an issuance of 550 crore rupees with a tenure of 37 months. The issuance carries a AAA rating from ICRA Limited. That concludes DebtCircle Sundown Brief for the 22nd of May 2026. Thank you for watching. Stay informed with DebtCircle.